When President Macron told Ibrahim Traoré to go back to Africa, no one expected the response that followed. What seemed like an insult turned into a moment of global awakening, as the young leader's calm reply stunned Europe and reshaped Africa's place in the world forever. The scene was set for what should have been a routine diplomatic exchange between two powerful nations. French President Emmanuel Macron, known for his sharp wit and calculated remarks, sat across from Ibrahim Traoré, the young and bold leader of Burkina Faso. The world's eyes were fixed on the high-stakes meeting, knowing that it would offer yet another glimpse into the shifting political dynamics between Africa and Europe. Macron, having spent years navigating the complexities of France's historical ties to its former African colonies, was no stranger to controversies. But this time, his comments would go beyond the usual diplomatic missteps. In a rare moment of candor, he leaned forward and, with a dismissive gesture, muttered the words, "Go back to Africa." The room fell into stunned silence. What Macron had intended as a throwaway line, perhaps to belittle Traoré's rise to power, had ignited a spark of fury and confusion. But the unexpected happened next. Traoré's response. Rather than erupting with anger or retaliating in kind, he simply stared back at Macron, his expression calm, almost serene. He didn't lash out. Instead, his next words would echo far beyond the walls of that meeting room, sending ripples through European capitals and sparking a new discourse on Africa's place in the world. Ibrahim Traoré was no stranger to pressure. At just 34 years old, he had ascended to the presidency of Burkina Faso after a coup that overthrew a corrupt and ineffective government. His rise was seen by many as a symbol of a new generation of African leaders, those who were determined to break free from the shackles of colonialism and establish their nations as self-determined powers. Traoré's leadership was, from the outset, unconventional. He represented a different kind of leadership in Africa, one that was less about following the script of the past, and more about reshaping the continent's future on his own terms. When Macron made his comment, it wasn't just an insult to a leader. It was an insult to the very idea of Africa's autonomy. But Traoré, poised beyond his years, understood something that many others didn't. He wasn't just defending his own dignity. He was defending Africa itself. His response, simple yet profound, left everyone in the room speechless. "Africa is where I belong, and it is where I will remain," Traoré said, his voice steady but unwavering. His words were like a subtle slap to the face of anyone who had underestimated the power of African sovereignty. The simplicity of his response was what made it so powerful. There was no need for grand gestures or emotional outbursts. Traoré knew that true power often lies in the ability to remain composed in the face of provocation. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every African nation that had ever been told to go back or stay in their place. He was telling Macron that Africa was not a place to be dismissed, nor a continent to be forgotten. It was, in fact, a place of power, history, and future potential. His calmness in the face of such a blatant provocation left Macron speechless, and his response would reverberate through the halls of European diplomacy for months to come. The fallout from Macron's comment was immediate and intense. The media exploded with commentary on the incident, dissecting the implications of the exchange from every angle. While some European commentators tried to defend Macron's words as an innocent misunderstanding, many saw the comment for what it truly was, a reflection of the lingering colonial attitudes that still pervade much of Europe's dealings with Africa. Traoré, on the other hand, was hailed as a hero across the African continent. His response was seen as a moment of resistance, a quiet but powerful assertion that Africa would no longer be dictated to or treated as a subordinate player on the world stage. For many, it was a declaration of independence not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. In the days that followed, conversations around the world began to shift. African leaders, long frustrated by Europe's paternalistic attitude, saw Traoré's response as a breakthrough moment. It was a reminder that Africa was no longer the passive, recipient of foreign aid or intervention. The time had come for African nations to stand on their own, to forge their own path and to define their own futures. Traoré's words weren't just a response to one man's disrespect. They were a rallying cry for the entire continent. Across Africa, the narrative was changing. Young people, activists, and political leaders alike began to talk about a future in which Africa was no longer defined by its colonial past, but by its rich history, its diverse cultures, and its immense potential. For the people of Burkina Faso, Traoré's response was nothing short of inspiring. They had watched as their country was mired in corruption and instability, only to see a new leader emerge who embodied their hopes for a better future. The coup that brought him to power was controversial, but many saw it as a necessary step in their fight against the forces of corruption and foreign influence. Traoré's calm, steady leadership was exactly what the nation needed. When he responded to Macron's insult with such dignity, it reinforced the idea that Burkina Faso's future would not be shaped by external forces. It would be shaped by Burkinabe people themselves, with their leader as the figurehead of their collective will. Across Ouagadougou, people gathered in the streets to celebrate, not just their leader, but a new era of African unity and strength. The young president had effectively shifted the narrative about Africa's place in the world. His response was more than just a diplomatic victory for Burkina Faso. It was a symbol of Africa's growing sense of agency. The age of African leaders, meekly accepting the whims of their former colonizers, was over. In his understated yet powerful reply to Macron, Traoré had proven that Africa no longer needed to bow to the pressures of Western powers. The rest of the world had been forced to confront the reality that Africa's time was now. In Europe, Macron's comment and Traoré's response stirred up a range of emotions. While some saw it as a diplomatic faux pas, others were uncomfortable with the implications of the exchange. Macron, who had often positioned himself as a leader of progressive thought, was now caught in a delicate position. His remarks had been seen as an example of old world arrogance, a reflection of the outdated, colonial mindset that many in Africa had long struggled against. The comment was seen by many as a stark reminder of Europe's long history of exploitation, and it was difficult for Macron to backpedal without seeming weak. His attempt to address the issue in the following days felt lackluster and insufficient. The damage had been done, and the power dynamic between Europe and Africa had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Internationally, Traoré became a figurehead of Africa's rise. He was now viewed not just as a leader of Burkina Faso, but as a symbol of the continent's growing political and economic influence. His response to Macron had struck a chord with people in every corner of Africa. It was proof that even the most powerful nations in the world would have to reckon with the fact that Africa was no longer content to be a passive player on the global stage. Traoré's leadership was being hailed as a beacon of hope for other African nations, many of which had spent decades under the influence of foreign powers. His example gave them the courage to stand up and assert their own independence. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré's approval ratings soared to unprecedented heights. His calm handling of the situation demonstrated his maturity and strength, and the people of his country responded by rallying behind him. His leadership was seen as a break from the past, a new chapter in Burkina Faso's history that was defined by a sense of dignity, self-reliance, and defiance against foreign interference. Traoré's rise had been swift, but it was clear that his connection to the people of Burkina Faso was strong. They saw in him not just a president, but a champion of their collective future. His response to Macron had further cemented his place in their hearts. As the months passed, the effects of Traoré's response continued to ripple through the global political landscape. African leaders, inspired by his bold stand, began to speak more openly about their desire for a more equitable relationship with the West. They were no longer willing to accept the outdated notion that Africa should be grateful for foreign aid or intervention. The conversation was shifting from one of dependency to one of mutual respect and cooperation. Traoré had ignited a spark, and it was spreading across the continent. For many in Europe, the realization that they could no longer dictate the terms of Africa's future was a difficult pill to swallow. The days of European powers imposing their will on African nations were long over. Traore had made that abundantly clear. The relationship between Europe and Africa was being redefined, and it was clear that the old power dynamics would no longer hold. Europe would have to find new ways to engage with Africa, one that respected the continent's growing influence and sovereignty. In the years that followed, Ibrahim Traoré's diplomatic and political influence only grew. He became one of the key voices in the African Union, pushing for greater regional cooperation and advocating for the continent's economic independence. No longer just a figurehead in Burkina Faso, Traoré became an emblem of a broader movement across Africa, one that aimed to rid the continent of lingering colonial influences and empower African nations to stand on their own in global affairs. As African economies began to grow at a rapid pace, fueled by natural resources, technological innovations, and a new sense of unity, Traoré's leadership was often cited as the turning point, the moment when Africa truly began to reshape its future on its own terms. Meanwhile, in Europe, Macron's reputation took a hit, and his administration struggled to repair the diplomatic damage caused by his remark. For months, French officials scrambled to manage the fallout, but the incident had exposed a deep-seated problem. European powers were no longer in control of the narrative when it came to Africa. The Old World Order, where colonial powers held sway over their former colonies, was being challenged in unprecedented ways. Macron found himself in a difficult position, as Europe faced its own internal struggles, particularly with the rise of populist movements and the economic instability that followed the pandemic. Macron's failure to navigate the shifting sands of international diplomacy became glaringly obvious. His comments had inadvertently highlighted Europe's enduring reliance on outdated thinking, and his attempts to recover from the blunder often appeared forced, as if he was trying to keep up with a world that had already passed him by. As the years unfolded, Ibrahim Traoré's legacy continued to shape the global conversation on Africa's future. His calm response to Macron's provocations became a defining moment in international relations, symbolizing a new era where African leaders were no longer content to be passive recipients of foreign policy. Burkina Faso, under his leadership, became a symbol of strength, self-reliance, and dignity, a nation that had, with one simple yet powerful reply, redefined its place on the world stage. Other African leaders, emboldened by his example, began to chart their own courses free from the influence of colonial powers, creating a unified front that was impossible for the West to ignore. For anyone watching, it was clear. Africa was no longer simply a continent to be shaped by others. It was a force in its own right. If you believe in bold leadership and the power of standing firm in your beliefs, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of resilience, leadership, and transformation from around the world.